High in the rolling hills of southeastern Turkey, on a limestone plateau overlooking a broad plain, lies a place that rewrites human history. To look at it today, it is nothing more than weathered stone standing in circular patterns, partly buried in dust and earth. But thousands of years ago, long before cities, writing, or even metal tools, people came here to build what may be the world's oldest temple. This place is called Göbekli Tepe, the Potbelly Hill, and for centuries it lay hidden beneath soil until its rediscovery in the 1990s revealed something no one thought possible: a sacred site dating back nearly 12,000 years. Before Göbekli Tepe, scholars believe that monumental architecture only appeared after farming and cities emerged. People settled, grew crops, and built villages, and then temples followed. But here, the story runs in reverse. Hunter-gatherers, who still lived by foraging, and small bands of communal life, gathered together to carve massive stone pillars weighing tons, arrange them into circles, and cover them with intricate carvings of animals. In other words, the world's first temple was built not by farmers, but by hunters. Religion, it seems, did not grow out of agriculture. Agriculture may have grown out of religion. Walking among the stones today, you see T-shaped pillars rising from the ground, some nearly 20 feet tall. They stand in rings, forming enclosures that would have been open to the sky. On their surfaces are carved animals: foxes, snakes, boars, vultures, and scorpions, each etched with a skill remarkable for its age. These are not random doodles. They are deliberate and symbolic. Some archaeologists believe they represent a kind of prehistoric belief system, where animals carried spiritual meaning, perhaps as guardians, dangers, or totems. The pillars themselves may have been stylized human figures, abstracted into T-shapes with arms faintly carved at their sides. The effort required to build Göbekli Tepe is staggering to imagine. The people who created it had no metal tools, no wheels, and no draft animals to haul stones. Yet they quarried pillars from nearby limestone, transported them uphill, and set them in carefully dug foundations. To do this would have required coordination among hundreds of people, far more than any single foraging band could provide. It suggests that communities gathered seasonally, uniting around ritual and belief. In other words, religion may have been the glue that bound together the first large groups of humans. But what happened here in daily life? That is the question that makes Göbekli Tepe both fascinating and elusive. There are no signs of permanent houses or fields. This was not a village where people lived year-round. Instead, it seems to have been a ceremonial gathering place. Bands of people may have come from miles around, bringing food, tools, and offerings. Feasts may have been held, rituals performed, and stories told around fires beneath the towering pillars. In the soil, archaeologists have found animal bones, flint tools, and traces of hearts, suggesting that meals were shared in large gatherings. For ordinary people who took part, the experience must have been awe-inspiring. Imagine approaching the hill after days of walking across plains and hills, carrying baskets of grain, hunted meat, or carved offerings. You climb the slope and see, rising from the ground, circles of towering stone pillars, each one etched with creatures that seemed both familiar and supernatural. As the sun set, the stones cast long shadows, and torches lit the carvings in flickering light. You gathered with hundreds of others, people speaking in different dialects, yet united in reverence. Songs, chants, or prayers may have echoed against the stones, binding the community in shared belief. Yet Göbekli Tepe also raises questions. Why did its builders eventually bury it? For reasons still unclear, the enclosures were deliberately filled in with rubble and earth, preserved beneath the hill for millennia. It may have been part of a ritual closure, marking the end of its sacred use. Or perhaps newer sites were built nearby, leaving the older ones to be entombed as relics. Whatever the reason, this act ensured its survival until modern times. When archaeologists uncovered it again, the discovery itself changed archaeology forever. For us, today, Göbekli Tepe is a silent place, its stones exposed under protective shelters, visited by tourists and scholars. But in its time, it was alive with human voices, footsteps, and rituals. It reminds us that long before history was written, humans were already gathering to seek meaning, to connect with forces greater than themselves, and to build monuments not of survival, but of belief. And so the first chapter of Lost Temples begins here, on a Turkish hilltop, where hunters became builders and where faith may have birthed civilization. Yet a question lingers in the silence of the stones. What drove those ancient people to spend such immense effort on a place of ritual when survival itself was already so hard? Was it devotion, fear, hope, or something we can no longer imagine? When you stand among the pillars of Göbekli Tepe today, it is easy to forget how astonishing they truly are. They are weathered and broken in places, but when freshly carved, more than 11,000 years ago, they must have gleamed pale against the sun. Their carvings sharp and alive, each enclosure was carefully planned, not random. At the center of every ring stood two massive T-shaped pillars, larger than the rest, facing each other like guardians or perhaps like deities themselves. Around them stood smaller pillars, creating a circle that enclosed the sacred space. The carvings on the pillars are among the most intriguing features. Snakes slither across stone, their bodies curling with precision. Vultures spread their wings, sometimes shown alongside headless human figures, perhaps symbolizing death and the sky world. Foxes, wild boars, gazelles, and even insects appear. There are scorpions and spiders, creatures that would have stirred both fear and awe. These images were not random decorations, but symbols that carried meaning for those who carved them. Some archaeologists think they reflect a worldview in which animals were spiritual beings, guides between realms, or protectors of the sacred. Others suggest they may have recorded myths or stories, now lost to us, that explain the cycles of life, death, and survival in a harsh world. One of the most striking discoveries is the presence of carved human arms and hands on some of the central pillars. The T-shapes, once thought to be purely abstract, may actually represent human forms, giant stylized figures standing watch over the enclosures. If this is true, then the central pillars were not merely posts, but statues of divine or ancestral beings. Imagine standing in the circle at night, the firelight flickering over stone giants with arms reaching down their sides, surrounded by carvings of animals both real and symbolic. For early humans, this must have been overwhelming, a place where the boundary between natural and supernatural blurred. But Göbekli Tepe was more than art. It was a gathering place. Archaeological evidence shows that feasts were held here. Massive amounts of animal bones have been found, particularly gazelle and wild cattle, suggesting that hunters brought large quantities of meat to be roasted and shared. Grinding stones, used for processing grain, indicate that people were preparing meals for hundreds, perhaps thousands. These were not everyday meals but ritual feasts, moments when scattered groups of hunter-gatherers came together to form something like a community. For people who normally lived in small bands, these gatherings must have been powerful, forging alliances, sharing stories, arranging marriages, and reinforcing belief. Some scholars suggest that these gatherings may have been the spark that pushed humans toward farming. To host such large feasts, people needed more food than hunting alone could reliably provide. They may have begun cultivating wild grains to ensure a steady supply, laying the foundation for agriculture. If this is true, then Göbekli Tepe was not only the first temple, it was also the cradle of farming, where ritual created the need for new ways of living. Civilization, in this view, did not create religion. Religion created civilization. And yet, the site raises puzzles. Why are there no signs of ordinary houses or permanent settlements? It seems clear that people did not live here year-round. Instead, they came seasonally, perhaps at times marked by the stars or by migrations of animals. The enclosures may have been aligned with celestial patterns, though this remains debated. Some researchers suggest that the carvings of vultures and celestial symbols could hint at early astronomical observations and rituals tied to the movement of the heavens. Then there is the greatest mystery. Why was Göbekli Tepe deliberately buried? The enclosures were filled in with rubble, soil, and broken tools, entombing them for millennia. Was this an act of reverence, a way of closing a sacred chapter? Or was it practical, perhaps, to make way for new structures above? Whatever the reason, the burial preserved the site in remarkable condition. Unlike open ruins that erode slowly over centuries, Göbekli Tepe slept beneath its mound, waiting for rediscovery. For modern archaeologists, uncovering the site was like stepping into a forgotten world. The realization that these pillars, dated to 9600 BCE or earlier, shocked the scholarly world. Stonehenge, long held as the great prehistoric temple, was younger by thousands of years. The pyramids of Egypt seemed like newcomers in comparison. Göbekli Tepe proved that organized ritual life existed far earlier than anyone expected. It forced a rewriting of the timeline of human development, showing that belief in symbolic architecture came before farming villages, not after. Yet for all the discoveries, so much remains unanswered. We do not know the names of the people who built Göbekli Tepe, or the language they spoke, or the myths they told. We do not know what prayers they whispered, what songs they sang, or what visions they saw in firelight. We can only stand among their stones and wonder. For the ordinary hunter-gatherers who came here, perhaps what mattered most was the sense of being part of something larger. In a world of small bands and constant movement, Göbekli Tepe was a place of permanence, a sanctuary of stone that outlasted lifetimes. To carve a pillar and see it stand must have given people the sense that their lives, so fleeting in the face of the wilderness, were part of a greater whole. And so the story deepens. Göbekli Tepe was not just a temple, it was a turning point in human history, a place where belief and community reshaped the very course of civilization. Yet the question lingers. What drove these people, without farming, without cities, to carve their faith into stone? Was it fear of death, reverence for nature, or a vision of gods now lost to us? As archaeologists carefully unearth Göbekli Tepe, circle by circle, what emerges is not only the scale of human ambition, but also its fragility. This temple complex, older than any city, was never meant to last forever. After centuries of use, its builders themselves buried it, sealing the enclosures with rubble and earth. Why they did so remains one of archaeology's greatest mysteries. To us, it feels like abandonment, but to them, it may have been an act of reverence, a deliberate closing of a sacred place. What makes this act remarkable is how complete it was. The enclosures were not left to crumble in the open air. They were carefully filled in, as though the builders wanted to preserve them for eternity, or perhaps to hide them from the world. The burial protected the carvings, preserving foxes and vultures, serpents and boars in astonishing clarity. For thousands of years, the stones slept beneath their mound, their significance forgotten even by the descendants of those who had raised them. The decision to bury the site raises haunting questions. Was it that new ritual centers were built elsewhere, making the old one obsolete? Did a shift in belief render the enclosures no longer suitable for worship? Or was it part of a cycle where sacred spaces were used, then sealed, then replaced? If so, Göbekli Tepe may be only one chapter of a much larger story of forgotten temples still buried beneath the hills of Anatolia. The site also forces us to reconsider what it means to be human. For a long time, archaeologists thought that belief, temples, and complex rituals came only after farming created surplus food and stable villages. But Göbekli Tepe suggests the opposite. Here, religion came first. It may have been the desire to gather, to feast, and to worship that drove humans to cultivate crops and domesticate animals. Ritual did not emerge from agriculture. Agriculture may have emerged from ritual. If so, then the very foundations of civilization owe their existence not to necessity alone, but to the human search for meaning. For the people of Göbekli Tepe, life was not easy. They were still hunter-gatherers, dependent on wild herds and seasonal plants. Survival was uncertain, food scarce, and dangers constant. Yet they invested extraordinary energy into raising stones. That served no immediate survival purpose to them. Survival must have meant more than food. It meant community, stories, shared purpose, and connection to the unseen. The stones were not only monuments, they were anchors for human identity. As centuries passed, the world around Göbekli Tepe changed. Agriculture spread, villages emerged, and new kinds of temples appeared, built by societies more settled and stratified. The enclosures on the hill, once filled with firelight and feasting, were closed and forgotten. The descendants of those who built them may have walked past the mound without knowing what lay beneath. Time buried not only the stones, but also the memory of the people who raised them. When modern archaeologists rediscovered the site in the late 20th century, they were stunned. The pillars pushed human history back by millennia. What had once been seen as impossible hunter-gatherers building monumental structures was revealed as fact. Every assumption about the origins of religion, art, and civilization had to be reconsidered. Göbekli Tepe showed that our ancestors were not only survivors of the wild, but also visionaries, who carved meaning into stone long before cities or kings existed. Yet despite decades of study, the site resists final explanation. Was it a place of ancestral worship, where the dead were honored through vulture carvings and headless figures? Was it a gathering place for seasonal feasts or a communal arena for scattered tribes? Was it a temple of the stars, aligned to constellations, its carvings reflecting the night sky? Or was it all of these at once, a fusion of survival, memory, and belief? For us today, Göbekli Tepe is a reminder of how much has been lost. We know the stones, but not the words spoken beneath them. We know the carvings, but not the myths they told. We know the feasts, but not the songs sung by firelight. The silence of the stones is both a gift and a wound. A gift because they survived, a wound because the voices that once gave them meaning are gone. And yet, perhaps that silence is what makes Göbekli Tepe so powerful. It invites us to imagine, to picture hunters laying down their spears to carve pillars, to picture women grinding grain for feasts, children chasing each other among stones taller than any tree they had ever seen, to picture rituals performed under starlight, prayers rising into the cold night air, and the scent of roasted meat and burning incense drifting across the plain. As you close your eyes and think of Göbekli Tepe, imagine standing there at dawn 12,000 years ago. The sun rises over the Anatolian plateau, lighting the limestone pillars with a golden glow. Shadows stretch across the enclosures, carvings of foxes and vultures coming alive in the changing light. People gather, carrying baskets, torches, and offerings. They move between stones that seem larger than life, whispering words we will never know. And as the day begins, you realize this was not just a place of stone, but of faith, community, and transformation. The question that lingers is the same one that haunted its rediscovery. Why did they build it at all? Why did humans, still living on the edge of survival, carve their faith into rock? Was it devotion, fear of death, or a vision of something greater? Perhaps Göbekli Tepe will never answer us. Perhaps its silence is its answer. That humanity has always sought meaning beyond survival, and not even in the harshest times. People have chosen to build not only for life but for the sacred. Beneath the waves of the Mediterranean, off the coast of modern-day Egypt, lies a city that once stood proud at the mouth of the Nile. For centuries, it was lost to memory, remembered only in fragmentary ancient texts that spoke of a place called Thonis Heraclean. Sailors and scholars alike dismissed it as legend, a half-forgotten echo of Egypt's golden age. But in the year 2000, divers searching the seafloor uncovered stone statues, inscriptions, and fragments of colossal temples. Slowly, the truth emerged: an entire city, once the gateway to Egypt, lay drowned beneath the sea, preserved in silt for more than 1,000 years. Thonis Heraclean, had been Egypt's great port on the Mediterranean long before Alexandria rose to fame. Situated near the Canopic branch of the Nile Delta, it was both a trading hub and a sacred city, home to towering temples where gods were honored and rituals performed. Its dual name reflects its double heritage: Thonis, the Egyptian name, and Heraclean, the Greek. Together they remind us that this was a city of crossroads, where Egypt met the wider Mediterranean world. At the heart of Thonis Heraclean stood its temples. The greatest of them was dedicated to Amun-Gareb, a form of the Egyptian god Amun, lord of kingship and fertility. Pilgrims came to offer sacrifices, priests maintained rituals, and kings affirmed their power by paying homage here. It was not only a center of worship, but also of legitimacy for foreign rulers who wished to claim authority over Egypt. Recognition at the temple of Amun-Gareb was a sacred requirement. The god's approval was mediated by the priests, whose power within the city was immense. Walking its streets in the 5th century BCE, you would have seen wide canals lined with boats, markets filled with goods from Greece, Phoenicia, and beyond, and monumental temples rising above it. All statues of gods and pharaohs guarded courtyards, while priests in white linen robes carried out rituals that had endured for centuries. Pilgrims entered with offerings of grain, oil, or incense, their prayers mingling with the chants of hymns echoing through stone halls. For ordinary citizens, life in Thonis Heraclean was a blend of sacred and practical. Merchants thrived in its harbors, sailors unloaded amphorae of wine, oil, and grain, and artisans crafted jewelry, pottery, and statues for both worship and trade. Farmers from the fertile Nile Delta supplied food to the markets, ensuring that the city bustled with abundance. Yet everything, from commerce to kingship, revolved around the temples. The gods were the city's guardians, and their approval was seen as essential for prosperity. But beneath its wealth and power, Thonis Heraclean lived under constant threat. The Nile Delta was unstable, its soil shifting, its waterways prone to change. Earthquakes shook the region, and the soft land beneath the city was vulnerable to subsidence. The very waters that brought it wealth could also swallow it whole. And one day, they did. Sometime between the 2nd century BC and the early centuries CE, a series of disasters, earthquakes, floods, and collapsing ground dragged the city beneath the sea. Temples, statues, markets, and homes sank into the mud, and the waves closed over them. Thonis Heraclean disappeared from memory for nearly 2 millennia. It lay forgotten. Only fragments of memory survived in ancient texts by Herodotus and Strabo, who spoke of a city where Heracles was honored and where Helen of Troy and Paris supposedly first entered Egypt. But as Alexandria grew and eclipsed the older port, even those faint echoes faded. By the medieval period, the name was gone, the city erased from maps, its temples drowned. And yet, beneath the waves, the city endured in silence, covered in silt, shielded from erosion. Its temples and statues lay preserved. When divers finally rediscovered it in 2000, they found colossal statues of pharaohs, priests, and gods still resting in the seabed. Bronze vessels, gold jewelry, and stone inscriptions were pulled from the mud. The temple of Amun-Gareb itself, though broken, revealed foundations and offerings that told of centuries of devotion. For us, Thonis Heraclean is a reminder of both the grandeur and fragility of human achievement, a city that once held Egypt's sacred gateway, a city where kings and priests affirmed divine authority, now rests underwater, silent but not gone. Its temples, once filled with prayers, now host fish and drifting seaweed. Its statues, once polished and revered, now wear coats of algae and coral. But the question lingers: why did the city sink? Was it a single catastrophic event, or a slow decline as the ground beneath gave way? And how many worshippers, traders, and priests watched in horror as their temples cracked and their streets flooded? For them, did it feel like the gods had abandoned their city, or was the drowning itself seen as a divine judgment? When divers first ascended into the waters of Abalkir Bay in 2000, They could not have imagined the scale of what lay beneath. At first it seemed like scattered stones and fragments, but then colossal statues emerged from the silt figures of pharaohs in rigid poses, priests in ceremonial dress, and gods carved from granite. As more was uncovered, the outline of a lost city revealed itself. Thonis Heraclean, Egypt's forgotten gateway to the Mediterranean. Among the discoveries were the remains of massive temples. The greatest was the sanctuary of Amun-Gareb, once the spiritual heart of the city. Divers found its foundation stretching across the seabed, with broken walls and toppled columns lying where they had fallen 2,000 years ago. Scattered among them were offering tables, altars, and ritual vessels, still in place as though abandoned mid-ceremony. Gold coins, jewelry, and small figurines were recovered, evidence of pilgrims who had left gifts to the gods. The sea had preserved them, sealing away the memory of rituals that once echoed through these halls. Life around the temples must have been deeply intertwined with religion. Ancient texts confirm that foreign rulers sought legitimacy here. Before the Macedonian Greeks under Alexander the Great established Alexandria, kings and generals recognized that true authority in Egypt required acknowledgement by Amun's priests. The temple at Thonis Heraclean was therefore not just a local shrine, but a place where politics and divinity overlapped. A king crowned in Memphis or Thebes could not be fully accepted without recognition at this sacred port for ordinary citizens. The temple structured the rhythms of daily life at dawn. Priests would have emerged in white linen robes, purified in sacred water, and lit incense at the altars. The scent of frankincense and myrrh would have filled the air, carried in from Arabia and Africa on the various ships that crowded the city's harbors. Hymns were chanted, offerings made, and statues of gods carried in procession through temple courtyards. To live in Thonis Heraclean was to live within earshot of divine ritual, to feel that the gods were never far from daily affairs. The city's harbors amplified its sacred role. Massive canals connected the temples directly to the sea. Ships arriving from Greece, Phoenicia, or beyond would pass statues and shrines as they entered, their goods inspected not only by officials but also by priests. Trade and religion fused together. Every amphora of wine, every jar of oil or grain, and every bundle of incense or papyrus that passed through the port carried a portion of its wealth into temple coffers. The gods and their guardians grew rich on commerce, and the city prospered because of it. The rediscovery of Thonis Heraclean has given archaeologists glimpses into these rituals. One striking find was a ceremonial barge preserved in the seabed. Such boats carried divine statues during festivals. When the god would be taken from the sanctuary and paraded through the city's canals, crowds would have gathered along the water, singing hymns, making offerings, and celebrating the presence of the divine in their midst. To the people, these were not symbolic processions. They were moments when the gods walked or rather sailed among them. And yet, even as divers pieced together this sacred city, they were reminded of its fragility. The same waters that had preserved Thonis Heraclean had also destroyed it. Geological studies suggest that earthquakes, floods, and soil liquefaction gradually undermined the land. The ground beneath the temple softened, columns toppled, and walls sank slowly. The city was swallowed. Some temples may have collapsed in sudden disaster, while others sank inch by inch. Imagine standing in the courtyard of Amun-Gareb as cracks appeared, hearing the groan of stone as walls shifted, and watching water seep into streets once lined with merchants and pilgrims. To those who lived it, the drowning must have felt apocalyptic. After its fall, the memory of Thonis Heraclean faded quickly. The rise of Alexandria just a few miles away ensured that Egypt's trade and rituals continued. Elsewhere, ancient writers mentioned the old port only in passing. Herodotus spoke of it as the place where Heracles had first entered Egypt. Others said Helen of Troy and Paris had stopped here on their fateful journey. But as centuries passed, the name became a whisper, half believed and half dismissed. By the medieval period, it was as if the city had never existed at all. For us today, the rediscovery is a gift. To see colossal statues pulled from the sea, their faces still serene after 2,000 years underwater, is to feel a connection across time, to touch an offering bowl left by a pilgrim, to read an inscription naming a forgotten priest, is to hear faint echoes of prayers once spoken, in stone temples now drowned. And yet the greatest mystery remains unsolved. Why did the gods of Thonis clan, so powerful in life, not save their city from destruction? Did the people believe the flood was punishment? Did they try to rebuild only to abandon the effort as the waters rose? Or did they see in the collapse a sign that the gods themselves had moved their favor to Alexandria? For more than 1,000 years, Thonis clan lay hidden beneath the Mediterranean, its temples entombed in silt, its statues resting in silence. When the divers and archaeologists finally uncovered it, they brought back not only broken stones, but an entire forgotten chapter of Egypt's sacred past. The city that had once been the gateway to Egypt had vanished almost without a trace. Yet its rediscovery reminds us of how fragile even the mightiest places can be. One of the most striking realizations is how central Thonis clan was to Egypt's identity. Before Alexandria, for centuries, this was the first port of entry into the kingdom. Foreigners arriving from Greece or Phoenicia would pass beneath its colossal temples before being allowed into the Nile Valley. Priests held the power to grant legitimacy, and kings recognized that their authority was incomplete without the blessing of Ammon at Thonis. The city's role was not secondary, but vital. It was a sacred threshold, both political and spiritual. The evidence recovered from the seabed reveals a city where ritual life was constant. Bronze vessels and gold jewelry were left as offerings. Stone stelae record decrees linking temple authority to royal power. Figurines of Osiris, Isis, and Horus suggest that the gods of the Nile were worshipped here as fervently as in Thebes or Memphis. Festivals must have filled the canals, with processions, music, and chanting. Imagine standing along the water as priests carried statues of the gods on ceremonial barges, their images gleaming in the sun, while incense drifted across the harbor to the people. This was not a mere spectacle. It was the assurance that their city was under divine protection. But that protection could not withstand the forces of nature. Geological studies suggest that earthquakes struck the delta, weakening the land beneath. The saturated soil liquefied under pressure, buildings toppled, and canals opened to the sea. The city sank, not in a single night, but gradually, with disasters spread across decades. Each collapse must have been terrifying: temple walls cracking, floors tilting, statues crashing into the mud. For priests who had long believed the gods safeguarded their city, these moments must have raised painful doubts. Did they blame themselves for failing to honor the gods? Did they see the drowning as divine judgment, or simply as fate? In the centuries after its fall, Alexandria absorbed its role. Traders forgot the old port, pilgrims turned elsewhere, and the memory of Thonis clan faded into myth. When Herodotus and Strabo mentioned it, they treated it as a place half legendary. By the medieval age, its name was gone. The temples that once defined the Nile's entrance were silent, their stones hidden beneath shifting tides. Yet when the city resurfaced in modern times, it brought more than artifacts, it brought perspective. The rediscovered statues, some towering over 16 feet tall, remind us of the scale of ambition that once existed here. The inscriptions link this drowned city to the wider currents of Egyptian and Mediterranean history, and the offerings found in temple ruins small. Personal gifts from forgotten hands show us that beyond kings and priests, ordinary people anchored their hopes and prayers in these sanctuaries. Today, Thonis clan lies partly excavated, still mostly submerged. Its treasures carefully lifted from the sea and preserved in museums. But much remains untouched beneath the waves. The silty waters protect the ruins, hiding more temples, statues, and vessels that may one day surface. Each discovery deepens the mystery. How much more lies beneath, and how much will forever remain sealed by the sea? The story of Thonis clan is not only about a city lost and found. It is about the cycle of grandeur and fragility that defines human history. A place once indispensable to Egypt, a city where gods were honored and kings crowned, became a ruin swallowed by nature. Its rediscovery reminds us that no achievement is permanent, not even temples built to house the eternal gods. And so, when you picture Thonis Heraclean today, imagine both its past and present. Picture the bustling harbor, the colossal temple of Amun-Garib, the processions along canals, the chants and hymns rising with incense smoke. Then picture the silence that followed the temple's broken. The city submerged, the god statues lying face down in the mud. Finally, picture the divers of our own age, their light sweeping across the seabed, revealing the faces of gods once again. The question that lingers is not only why the city sank, but why it was forgotten so completely. How can a place once so vital disappear from memory? Perhaps it is a reminder that history itself is fragile. That memory fades as surely as stone crumbles. And yet, beneath the waves, the temples endured, waiting for us to find them again. In the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, on the small islands of Malta and Gozo, stand some of the most extraordinary temples in the world. To visit them today is to walk among massive stone slabs, arranged in circles and chambers, weathered by thousands of years but still imposing. What makes them astonishing is not only their size but also their age. These megalithic temples of Malta were built between 3600 and 2500 BCE, making them older than Stonehenge in Britain and even the pyramids of Egypt. They are, in fact, among the oldest freestanding stone structures on Earth. The builders of these temples left no written records, no chronicles of why they raised them or how. What survives are the stones themselves, colossal blocks weighing several tons, fitted together to create doorways, apses, and altars. Some temples, like Kawar Kim and Manasdra, rise on hilltops overlooking the sea. Others, like Qugantija on the island of Gozo, form massive complexes that even the local name preserves. Qugantija means giant's tower, for villagers believed only giants could have raised such stones. When you step inside one of these temples, you find curved rooms that suggest they were designed as places of ritual. In many, archaeologists have discovered altars stained with traces of animal sacrifice, figurines of corpulent female figures often called fat ladies, and decorative carvings of spirals, trees, and plants. The spirals, in particular, seem to echo the cycles of nature, the turning of seasons, the rhythm of life and death. These details point to a people deeply connected to the natural world, who built temples not for kings or armies but for the cycles that sustain them. Imagine life on Malta 5,000 years ago. The islands were small, rocky, and isolated, with limited farmland. Families lived in villages of stone huts, tending fields of wheat and barley, herding goats and sheep, and fishing in the surrounding seas. Life was demanding, survival uncertain. Yet these people invested immense labor in raising temples of stone, far beyond what was needed for daily living. This tells us that religion, ritual, or community gatherings were central to their identity. The temples may have been places where the entire community came together, feasting, praying, marking seasons, and honoring ancestors. One of the most remarkable aspects is the sophistication of the architecture. The builders aligned some temples with astronomical events. At Manasdra, for example, the doorway is oriented so that on the solstices, the rising sun shines directly through it, illuminating the interior, and a deliberate play of light and shadow. To create such alignments required not only skill but generations of observation, watching the heavens, marking the sun's path, and embedding cosmic rhythms into stone. For a small island community, this was a monumental achievement. Yet the temples were not purely functional. They were decorated with care. Carvings of plants and spirals cover altars, as if the builders wanted to bring the natural world into stone. Figurines of seated female figures, sometimes interpreted as fertility goddesses, suggest a belief system that honored the cycles of birth and renewal. Whether these figures truly represented goddesses or were simply symbolic of abundance remains debated, but their presence hints at a society where women, fertility, and the continuity of life were held in reverence. For the people who built them, The temples must have been awe-inspiring. Imagine walking up a hillside path, carrying offerings of grain or animals, and seeing massive limestone blocks rising against the sky. Inside, torches flickered against spiraled carvings. Priests or elders prepared rituals, and the community gathered in silence. The sense of being part of something larger, something eternal, would have bound people together, turning survival into meaning. But how did they move such stones? Some weigh more than 20 tons, larger than anything the islanders should have been able to handle with their simple tools. Archaeologists believe they used wooden rollers and sledges, ropes of twisted fiber, and sheer manpower. The effort required coordination across entire communities. Every temple, then, was not just a religious act, but a communal one, villagers united by the shared labor of raising something that would outlast them. For thousands of years, these temples were the center of Maltese life. Generation after generation returned to them, expanding, rebuilding, and honoring traditions. Yet by around 2500 BCE, the temple culture abruptly ended. The reasons are still uncertain. Some suggest environmental collapse, soil exhaustion, or famine. Others suggest that new cultural influences arrived, replacing the old traditions. Whatever the cause, the temples were abandoned, left to wind and weather. And yet, even abandoned, they endured. Local memory remembered them as the work of giants, stories passed down through centuries. When European scholars rediscovered them in the modern era, they were astonished at their age and sophistication. Here, on a small island, had flourished one of the world's earliest temple-building cultures long before the civilizations usually credited with such grandeur. Today, walking through the megalithic temples of Malta, you feel both closeness and distance. The stones are still there, still aligned to the sun, still etched with spirals and plant motifs. You can touch the same blocks that ancient hands set in place 5,000 years ago. And yet, the people who built them are gone, their language lost, their beliefs only faintly guessed at through figurines and carvings. The question lingers, why did they build so many temples on such small islands with such effort? What did they hope to achieve by carving eternity into limestone? Was it gratitude for survival, fear of death, reverence for ancestors, or hope for renewal? We may never know, but the stones remain, silent witnesses to one of humanity's earliest leaps toward the sacred. The stones of Malta's megalithic temples stand silent today, but in their prime, they must have been alive with ritual and meaning. Archaeologists can only piece together fragments of what took place inside their walls. Yet the evidence paints a picture of a society where the sacred was woven into daily life. These temples were not simply monuments, they were living places where ceremonies, feasts, and prayers bound communities together. Inside the temples, altars of stone were discovered, some still stained with traces of animal bone and ash. This suggests that sacrifices were offered, likely of goats, sheep, or cattle, animals central to survival on the islands. The offerings may have been both practical and symbolic, meat roasted and shared among participants, smoke rising toward the heavens as a gift to unseen forces. For villagers, such rituals transformed the struggles of daily survival into sacred acts, giving meaning to the hardships of farming rocky soil and fishing uncertain seas. Among the most fascinating finds are the figurines often called the Fat Ladies of Malta. These small statues, carved of stone or clay, depict seated female figures with broad hips and rounded bodies. Their size and posture suggest abundance, fertility, and continuity. Some scholars believe they represent goddesses of life and renewal. Others argue they are symbolic ancestors, mothers of the community. Either way, their presence in the temples underscores the centrality of fertility of fields, animals, and people in the islanders' worldview. For a small, isolated community, the cycles of birth and harvest were truly matters of survival. But ritual was not only about sacrifice. The architecture itself was part of the ceremony. Many temples were built with apses curved side chambers, creating a flowing, organic shape rather than rigid lines. Some scholars suggest that the temples may have been designed to echo the form of the human body, perhaps representing the womb. If so, entering the temple would have been a symbolic journey into the source of life. Reinforcing themes of fertility and renewal, astronomy also played a role. The Manasdra temple, perched on a hillside facing the sea, is aligned with the solstices and equinoxes. On the summer solstice, the rising sun shines directly onto a stone slab at the heart of the temple. On the winter solstice, it illuminates another. This was no accident. Generations must have observed the skies, marking the sun's path, building their temples so that cosmic cycles entered directly into ritual space. For a farming society, knowing when to plant and harvest was essential. But aligning this knowledge with worship turned practicality into spirituality. The cosmos itself became part of the temple. Daily life on Malta in this era was modest but communal. Families lived in stone houses, raising crops of barley and wheat, herding animals, and fishing in the surrounding seas. Food was often scarce, the soil thin, and resources limited. Yet the labor invested in the temple shows that people believed survival alone was not enough. They needed meaning, continuity, and connection to something greater. By gathering in temples, they reaffirmed their bonds not only to each other, but also to the forces of nature and the cycles of life they could not control. The rituals likely involved music and sound as well. Within the hypogeum of Walsaflienia's subterranean temple discovered later, researchers found that certain chambers resonate at particular frequencies, amplifying the human voice. This suggests that chanting or drumming may have been part of ceremonies, filling the temple with sound that vibrated in the bones of those present. Even in the open-air temples, the curved walls may have amplified voices, turning ritual words into echoes that surrounded participants. Imagine standing in a circle of massive stones, flames flickering, voices chanting, and the air vibrating with sound. Such experiences would have bound individuals into a collective whole, reinforcing shared belief. But the mystery remains. Why did the temple culture end so suddenly? Around 2500 BCE, construction ceased, rituals stopped, and the people who had invested centuries of effort into these monuments abandoned them. Archaeologists suggest several possibilities. Soil exhaustion may have made farming unsustainable. Climate change could have brought drought. Overpopulation may have strained resources. Or perhaps new groups arrived, bringing different traditions that replaced the old ways. The truth may be a mixture of all these for the last generations who worshipped here. The decline must have been gradual, but unmistakable. Harvests failing, flocks dwindling, storms battering the islands. It would have seemed as though the gods themselves had turned away. Rituals that once brought assurance may have become desperate pleas. The same stones that had represented continuity now stood as silent witnesses to collapse. Eventually, people walked away, leaving the temples to the wind and sea. For thousands of years, the temples lay abandoned. Local memory preserved them in legend, calling them the work of giants. Villagers saw the massive stones and assumed no ordinary humans could have raised them. When European travelers rediscovered them in the modern era, they were astonished not only by the size of the structures but also by their age. Here, on these small islands, people had built temples before Egypt's pyramids rose, before Britain's Stonehenge was even imagined. And so the question lingers, why did such a small and isolated community devote itself so completely to building in stone? Was it faith, fear, or the human need to leave something enduring behind? The temples remind us that survival alone has never been enough for humanity. Even in the most fragile conditions, people have chosen to create monuments of meaning. The megalithic temples of Malta stand today as quiet ruins, their stones bleached by centuries of sun and wind. Tourists wander through their chambers. Archaeologists measure and record. But the people who once filled them with chants, feasts, and offerings are long gone. What endures is the mystery. Why were they built? Why were they abandoned? And what do they mean for us today? The builders left no writing, no chronicles, and no myths committed to stone. All we have are clue spirals carved on altars, figurines of corpulent figures, traces of animal sacrifice, and alignments of the sun. These fragments suggest a society deeply concerned with fertility, cycles, and continuity. They saw themselves as part of a greater rhythm, one that tied the survival of their flocks and fields to the turning of the heavens. The temples were not palaces or fortresses, but sanctuaries, places where communities could gather to affirm their connection to forces beyond their control. The abrupt end of this temple culture around 2500 BCE is one of archaeology's great puzzles. Soil exhaustion seems likely on small islands. Farming without rotation or replenishment would eventually strip the land. Climate change may have played a role to droughts, or storms reducing harvests, forcing people to abandon ritual for sheer survival. Whatever the cause, the people walked away, and with them vanished the beliefs that had sustained centuries of temple building. For the last generation that worshipped at Menasdra or Kawarkim, the experience must have been bittersweet. They entered chambers their ancestors had carved, lit fires on altars worn smooth by centuries, and prayed for abundance. But when the rains failed or the soil yielded less, those prayers may have seemed unanswered. The gods carved in stone had given stability for generations, yet now their silence grew unbearable. At some point, the people turned their backs on the temples, leaving them to crumble. And so the stones remain, exposed to centuries of wind, rain, and human neglect. Local villagers passed down legends that the temples had been built by giants, for surely no ordinary humans could raise such colossal stones. These stories preserved memory and myth, even as the true builders were forgotten. In modern times, archaeologists revealed their true age, proving that long before the great civilizations of Egypt, Mesopotamia, or Greece, the people of Malta had raised sanctuaries in stone. The discovery changed our understanding of history. It showed that complex ritual life and monumental architecture did not require vast empires or kings. Even small island communities, with limited resources, could create sacred spaces that outlasted millennia. The Maltese temples stand as proof that humans have always sought to transform survival into meaning, to turn daily struggle into rituals that connect life with eternity, standing among the ruins. Today, you can almost hear echoes. Imagine torches flickering on carved spirals, the smell of roasted meat from sacrificial feasts, and the murmur of prayers rising toward the open sky. Imagine children watching in awe as priests or elders spoke beneath towering stones, connecting their community to cycles of sun and season. These echoes linger, even in silence. The legacy of Malta's temples is not only their age but also their lesson. They remind us that humanity's oldest monuments were not built for kings or conquests, but for meaning. They were places where ordinary people gathered to reaffirm that life was more than survival. That community and belief could endure longer than any harvest. The stones themselves became memory, anchors of permanence in a fragile world. And so the question that remains is timeless. What compelled people with so little, living on small islands with scarce resources, to invest so much in stone? Was it devotion, fear of death, gratitude for survival, or the longing to touch eternity? Perhaps it was all of these. The temples of Malta do not answer, but in their silence they invite us to ask, again and again, what it means to be human. Beneath the streets of modern Valletta and Malta lies one of the most haunting and extraordinary monuments of the ancient world, hidden for thousands of years, carved entirely underground. It is known as the Hypogeum of Wall Saflieni, a vast labyrinth of chambers, stairways, and carved stone sanctuaries that once served as both temple and necropolis. Unlike the megalithic temples above ground, here the sacred was taken below, into the earth itself, into a space that blurred the boundary between the living and the dead. Discovered by accident in 1902 when construction workers cut into it, the Hypogeum revealed an underground world unlike anything seen before. 3 levels of chambers extend deep into limestone, connected by corridors and stairways. Some rooms are small and simple, while others are grand and carefully designed, with carved ceilings, altars, and niches for offerings. At its height, it may have held the remains of more than 7,000 individuals, their bones interred in collective burials alongside ritual objects. The hypogeum dates to around 4000 to 2500 BCE, making it contemporary with Malta's megalithic temples above ground. But while those temples celebrated life and fertility under the open sky, the hypogeum seems to have been devoted to death, ancestors, and the mysteries of the underworld. Here, the people of Malta carved out a sacred space where the dead were not separated from the living, but brought into the very heart of ritual life. Imagine descending into the hypogeum and its prime. The entrance would have been narrow, leading into a dark corridor lit only by flickering oil lamps. The air would have been cool and heavy, carrying the scent of limestone and incense. As you step deeper, chambers open around you, some circular, some rectangular. Their walls painted with red ochre spirals and patterns. The spirals, echoing those carved in the surface temples, may have symbolized cycles of life, death, and rebirth in the subterranean world. They became reminders that death was not an end, but part of a greater rhythm. The central chambers of the hypogeum were carefully designed to mimic the architecture of the temples above ground. Carved pillars and lintels created the illusion of megaliths, though all was hewn from solid rock. In the oracle room, a small chamber with curved walls, sound resonates at a frequency that amplifies the human voice. A single chant could fill the chamber, vibrating in the bones of those present, creating an atmosphere both awe-inspiring and otherworldly for participants. Rituals here must have felt like standing on the threshold of another realm. The voices of priests echoing like the voices of gods or ancestors. The dead were everywhere. Bones were found placed in niches, on shelves, or in collective heaps. Some chambers were clearly burial spaces, but others seemed to have been reserved for ritual. Perhaps families brought their dead here in ceremonies, depositing bones alongside offerings of pottery, beads, or figurines. In this way, the hypogeum became a communal tomb, where the ancestors of the entire community rested together, shaping identity not around kings or rulers but around shared ancestry. One of the most famous discoveries within the hypogeum is the Sleeping Lady, a small figurine of a woman reclining on her side, her body rounded and serene, her face calm. She may represent death, sleep, or eternal rest, but her peaceful posture suggests that for the people of Malta, death was not feared but embraced as part of life. To place her in the hypogeum was to affirm that the dead rested in tranquility, watched over by the sacred. For ordinary villagers, the hypogeum must have been both frightening and reassuring. Death was ever present in their lives. Infant mortality, disease, and accidents were common. To know that their loved ones lay in a sacred place, tended by priests, honored with rituals, must have given comfort. At the same time, descending into darkness, hearing chants resonate, and seeing spirals painted on walls must have stirred awe and reverence, reminding them that life was brief but part of something enduring. And yet, the purpose of the hypogeum is still debated. Was it primarily a burial place, or was it a temple for initiation, ritual, and contact with the dead? The careful design of chambers, the acoustics of the oracle room, and the symbolic paintings suggest it was more than a tomb. It was a place where the living and the dead met, where ancestors guided the community, and where death was transformed into continuity. For centuries, the hypogeum was used and expanded. Generations carved new chambers, painted new spirals, and interred new bones. Each layer of stone carries memory upon memory, like voices echoing through time. But eventually, like the surface temples, it was abandoned. The reasons remain uncertain. Climate change, famine, or cultural shifts may have ended the traditions. The hypogeum was sealed, forgotten, and hidden beneath centuries of soil until chance uncovered it again today. As you walk through its chambers, carefully lit for preservation, you sense both presence and absence. Presence, in the bones and artifacts of thousands who once came here. Absence, in the silence of rituals no longer performed. The hypogeum reminds us that the search for meaning has always included both life and death, that the earliest temples were as much about the ancestors as about the living. And so we are left with a question. What did the people of Malta truly believe happened to them? Did they brought into this place? Did they think their ancestors guided them from the shadows? Or that the spirals painted on walls carried souls into eternity? The stones do not answer, but their silence makes the question echo all the more. Descending into the hypogeum was more than a physical act, it was symbolic. Every step downward took people from the world of light into the realm of shadow, from the living earth into the sacred domain of ancestors. For the ancient Maltese, this journey must have carried profound meaning. Above ground, the megalithic temples faced the sun, aligned with solstices and seasons, celebrating fertility and renewal. Below ground, the hypogeum echoed a different rhythm, the quiet endurance of death, silence, and memory. Together, the two traditions formed a complete worldview, life above, death below, each part of the same cycle. One of the most extraordinary features of the hypogeum is its acoustics. In the oracle room, a small chamber with curved walls, even a whisper can be magnified into a deep resonance that fills the space. When someone chanted at certain frequencies, especially around 110 Hz, the sound vibrated through the limestone, enveloping those present in waves of echo. Modern experiments show that the effect is both physical and psychological. Voices deepen, sound carries, and listeners feel vibrations in their bones. For those in prehistory, the experience must have felt supernatural. The chamber itself became part of the ritual, turning human speech into the voice of gods or spirits. Imagine the ceremony. A procession enters, by lamplight, carrying offerings. Bones of ancestors are placed in niches, and figurines of fertility and abundance are set on altars. The group gathers in the oracle room. A priest begins to chant, his voice resonating, the sound multiplying, shaking the chamber. To those present, it would have seemed as if unseen beings answered, as if the ancestors themselves spoke through the stone. In such moments, the boundary between living and dead blurred completely. The hypogeum's paintings add another layer of mystery. Red ochre spirals adorn some walls, repeating motifs seen in surface. Temples' spirals are simple to draw, yet endlessly symbolic. They may have represented the sun's path, the turning of seasons, and the winding journey of life into death. In the darkness of the hypogeum, illuminated by flickering oil lamps, these spirals would have appeared to move, shifting and shimmering. To the ancient Maltese, they may have seemed like doorways, paths for the soul, reminders that death was not an end, but a continuation. The burials themselves suggest a communal understanding of death, unlike later cultures that emphasize individual tombs for kings or elites. The hypogeum held thousands together. Bones were placed collectively, without obvious markers of rank. This suggests a society where ancestors were honored as a group, where the community's identity rested on shared continuity rather than individual glory. Every person, whether farmer, artisan, or priest, returned to the same chambers, joining a collective ancestry that guided the living. The sleeping lady figurine captures this philosophy. Reclining peacefully on her side, her body rounded, she is serene, untroubled. She does not depict struggle or violence, but rest. For the people of Malta, death may have been seen not as terror, but as sleep, a passage into another form of being. To place her in the hypogeum was to assure the dead and the living who mourn them that rest was eternal and peace was possible. Daily life above ground must have revolved around preparing for these rituals. Farmers grew crops, herders tended animals, and artisans carved figurines and vessels. When a member of the community died, families prepared offerings and carried bones into the hypogeum. Over generations, layer upon layer of burials accumulated, each new death adding to the collective ancestry. For the living, to enter the hypogeum was to join a chain of memory that stretched back centuries. But the hypogeum was not only for the dead, it was also a temple for the living. The acoustics, paintings, and architecture suggest that rituals for fertility, renewal, and cosmic order were performed here as well. In this sense, the underground chambers were not cemeteries alone. They were liminal spaces where the living entered to commune with forces larger than themselves. Priests may have spoken in resonant tones, declaring omens or guidance from ancestors. Families may have brought children here in initiation, linking them to the line of the dead. Entire villages may have gathered for rituals marking planting, harvest, or solstices, reaffirming the balance of life and death. The hypogeum shows us a culture that did not separate survival from meaning. They understood that life was fragile on small islands with scarce resources, but they chose to transform the fragility into ritual. The underground temple was a way of saying, we endure, not just as individuals, but as a community bound across generations. And yet, the silence of its abandonment lingers. Around 2500 BCE, the temple culture of Malta ended abruptly. The hypogeum, like the surface temples, was sealed and forgotten. The reasons are still debated. Was it famine, soil exhaustion, or disease? Did people lose faith when the land could no longer sustain them? Did newcomers bring different traditions? Whatever the cause, the silence in its chambers became permanent. Bones remained, figurines lay undisturbed, and spirals faded in darkness. The living never returned. Today, walking through the hypogeum, carefully protected to preserve it, you feel both awe and unease. The chambers are narrow, the air heavy, and the walls etched with patterns that once guided souls. Even without rituals, the acoustics still resonate. Stand in the oracle room and speak softly, and you hear your own voice return with otherworldly depth. The stones themselves still carry memory, even without the people who once animated them. And so the hypogeum forces us to ask, why did these people pour such effort into carving an underground labyrinth when survival above ground was already so difficult? What compelled them to spend lifetimes building a sanctuary for the dead when food and safety were never guaranteed? Perhaps the answer is that meaning has always mattered as much as survival. That to be human is to seek not only to live, but to understand why. Descending into the hypogeum was more than a physical act, it was symbolic. Every step downward took people from the world of light into the realm of shadow, from the living earth into the sacred domain of ancestors. For the ancient Maltese, this journey must have carried profound meaning. Above ground, the megalithic temples faced the sun, aligned with solstices and seasons, celebrating fertility and renewal. Below ground, the hypogeum echoed a different rhythm, the quiet endurance of death, silence, and memory. Together, the two traditions formed a complete worldview: life above, death below, each part of the same cycle. One of the most extraordinary features of the hypogeum is its acoustics. In the oracle room, a small chamber with curved walls, even a whisper can be magnified into a deep resonance that fills the space. When someone chanted at certain frequencies, especially around 110 Hz, the sound vibrated through the limestone, enveloping those present in waves of echo. Modern experiments show that the effect is both physical and psychological. Voices deepen, sound carries, and listeners feel vibrations in their bones. For those in prehistory, the experience must have felt supernatural. The chamber itself became part of the ritual, turning human speech into the voice of gods or spirits. Imagine the ceremony. A procession enters, by lamplight, carrying offerings. Bones of ancestors are placed in niches, and figurines of fertility and abundance are set on altars. The group gathers in the oracle room. A priest begins to chant, his voice resonating, the sound multiplying, shaking the chamber. To those present, it would have seemed as if unseen beings answered, as if the ancestors themselves spoke through the stone. In such moments, the boundary between living and dead blurred completely. The hypogeum's paintings add another layer of mystery. Red ochre spirals adorn some walls, repeating motifs seen in surface. Temples' spirals are simple to draw, yet endlessly symbolic. They may have represented the sun's path, the turning of seasons, and the winding journey of life into death. In the darkness of the hypogeum, illuminated by flickering oil lamps, these spirals would have appeared to move, shifting and shimmering, to the ancient Maltese. They may have seemed like doorways, paths for the soul, reminders that death was not an end, but a continuation. The burials themselves suggest a communal understanding of death, unlike later cultures that emphasize individual tombs for kings or elites. The hypogeum held thousands together. Bones were placed collectively, without obvious markers of rank. This suggests a society where ancestors were honored as a group, where the community's identity rested on shared continuity rather than individual glory. Every person, whether farmer, artisan, or priest, returned to the same chambers, joining a collective ancestry that guided the living. The sleeping lady figurine captures this philosophy. Reclining peacefully on her side, her body rounded, she is serene, untroubled. She does not depict struggle or violence, but rest. For the people of Malta, death may have been seen not as terror, but as sleep, a passage into another form of being. To place her in the hypogeum was to assure the dead and the living who mourned them that rest was eternal and peace was possible. Daily life above ground must have revolved around preparing for these rituals. Farmers grew crops, herders tended animals, and artisans carved figurines and vessels. When a member of the community died, families prepared offerings and carried bones into the hypogeum. Over generations, layer upon layer of burials accumulated, each new death adding to the collective ancestry. For the living, to enter the hypogeum was to join a chain of memory that stretched back centuries. But the hypogeum was not only for the dead, it was also a temple for the living. The acoustics, paintings, and architecture suggest that rituals for fertility, renewal, and cosmic order were performed here as well. In this sense, the underground chambers were not cemeteries alone. They were liminal spaces where the living entered to commune with forces larger than themselves. Priests may have spoken in resonant tones, declaring omens or guidance from ancestors. Families may have brought children here in initiation, linking them to the line of the dead. Entire villages may have gathered for rituals marking planting, harvest, or solstices, reaffirming the balance of life and death. The hypogeum shows us a culture that did not separate survival from meaning. They understood that life was fragile on small islands with scarce resources, but they chose to transform the fragility into ritual. The underground temple was a way of saying, we endure, not just as individuals, but as a community bound across generations. And yet, the silence of its abandonment lingers. Around 2500 BCE, the temple culture of Malta ended abruptly. The hypogeum, like the surface temples, was sealed and forgotten. The reasons are still debated. Was it famine, soil exhaustion, or disease? Did people lose faith when the land could no longer sustain them? Did newcomers bring different traditions? Whatever the cause, the silence in its chambers became permanent. Bones remained, figurines lay undisturbed, and spirals faded in darkness. The living never returned. Today, walking through the hypogeum, carefully protected to preserve it, you feel both awe and unease. The chambers are narrow, the air heavy, and the walls etched with patterns that once guided souls. Even without rituals, the acoustics still resonate, stand in the oracle. Rumen speaks softly, and you hear your own voice return with otherworldly depth. The stones themselves still carry memory, even without the people who once animated them. And so the hypogeum forces us to ask, why did these people pour such effort into carving an underground labyrinth when survival above ground was already so difficult? What compelled them to spend lifetimes building a sanctuary for the dead when food and safety were never guaranteed? Perhaps the answer is that meaning has always mattered as much as survival. That to be human is to seek not only to live, but to understand why. High in the thin air of the Bolivian Altiplano, where the Andes rise cold and wide, lies the ancient city of Tiwanaku. At first glance, It seems like little more than scattered stones across a windswept plain. Yet for centuries it was the heart of a powerful civilization. Among its ruins stands the Kalasasaya Temple, a vast rectangular court of stone that once served as both a ceremonial center and a cosmic observatory. Though weathered by time, its walls and monoliths still hint at a culture that saw the heavens and the earth as bound together, where rituals shaped the lives of thousands in one of the world's most extreme landscapes. The Kalasasaya Temple is massive, about 120 meters long and 130 meters wide, enclosed by towering stone walls and lined with carefully cut blocks fitted without mortar. Within its rectangle stood altars, statues, and sacred spaces where ceremonies unfolded. The most famous of its monuments is the Gateway of the Sun, a single block of stone carved with intricate figures and symbols. Its central image depicts a deity sometimes called the staff god or the sun god, flanked by winged attendants. This image became so important that it influenced later Andean civilizations, including the Inca, who revered similar deities. For the people of Tiwanaku, the Kalasasaya was not only a temple, but also a calendar in stone. Its walls were aligned with the solstices and equinoxes, allowing priests to mark the movement of the sun across the horizon. On the solstices, the sun rose or set precisely along the temple's corners, casting light into the court. In this way, the temple functioned as both sanctuary and observatory, helping to regulate agricultural cycles in a harsh environment where timing was crucial. To plant too early mid-frost would kill crops, too late, and harvest would fail. By watching the heavens from Kalasasaya, Tiwanaku's priests linked survival itself to ritual knowledge. Imagine standing in the temple during the solstice. The air is thin and cold, the mountains distant but clear. Hundreds gather in the court, wrapped in woven textiles against the chill. Priests, dressed in elaborate headdresses, watch the horizon as the sun rises. At that moment, light strikes the walls exactly where they expect, confirming the order of the cosmos. The crowd chants, offerings are made, and fires are lit. The sun is honored, the cycles reaffirmed, and the community reassured that the gods still favor their survival. The Kalasasaya was part of a larger ceremonial complex at Tiwanaku. Nearby stood the semi-subterranean temple, a sunken court whose walls are lined with carved stone heads. Each head is different, suggesting they represented the diversity of peoples brought into Tiwanaku's orbit. Together, the semi-subterranean temple and Kalasasaya formed a ritual sequence. Participants descended into the earth, surrounded by ancestral faces, then emerged into the elevated court of Kalasasaya to witness the heavens, life, death, ancestry, and cosmos were all bound together in this ritual architecture. Daily life in Tiwanaku was shaped by these ceremonies. Farmers cultivated potatoes, quinoa, and maize using raised fields that trapped heat and moisture. Ingenious methods that made survival possible at altitudes above 3,800 meters. Herds of llamas and alpacas provided wool, meat, and transport. Artisans crafted fine ceramics and textiles, often decorated with images of the staff gods seen on the Gateway of the Sun. Every aspect of life from planting to weaving to herding was tied back to rituals in the Kalasasaya, which confirmed that human effort aligned with cosmic order. For ordinary people, the temple must have been both intimidating and reassuring. To stand within its massive walls, surrounded by monoliths carved with deities, was to feel part of something larger than the individual or even the community. The temple's alignment with the sun reassured them that the gods watched over their fields, yet it also demanded obedience. The rituals were not optional, but essential to survival. In this way, the Kalasasaya bound people together through both belief and necessity. And yet, for all its grandeur, the temple remains mysterious. We do not know the names of its gods, the words of its prayers, or the details of its ceremonies. The Tiwanaku people left no written records, only stones and artifacts. Archaeologists interpret, but much is speculation. Did priests sacrifice animals or humans here? Did they use hallucinogenic plants to induce visions of the gods? Were the carved stone heads ancestors, enemies, or symbolic spirits? Each possibility deepens the mystery, but leaves no certainty. The decline of Tiwanaku around the 11th century CE adds to the enigma. Climate change, drought, and political shifts may have undermined the society. As the raised fields dried and harvests failed, the rituals at Kalasasaya may have seemed less effective. The temple that once guaranteed cosmic order may have become a reminder of failure. Eventually, the people abandoned the city, leaving its stones to the wind. The gateway of the sun toppled, walls cracked, and ceremonies ceased. Today, the Kalasasaya stands as a ruin, but also as a reminder of ambition. To build such a court at high altitude, to align it with the sun, and to carve gods into stone required vision and perseverance. The people of Tiwanaku turned one of the most challenging landscapes on Earth into a center of ritual and meaning. They endured through belief as much as through ingenuity. And so the Kalasasaya asks us a question. Was it built more for survival or for faith? Did the priests align its walls to ensure harvests, or to reassure the people that the universe was ordered? Perhaps the answer is both. In Tiwanaku, as in so many ancient places, survival and belief were inseparable, carved together into stone that still stands against the cold wind of the Altiplano. The Kalasasaya temple was not only a monument of stone, but also a stage for ritual, where the people of Tiwanaku bound their lives to the rhythms of the cosmos. Its vast rectangular court, with towering walls and carefully placed monoliths, was designed to frame the sky for the priests who led ceremonies. This was not architecture alone, it was a tool to measure the passage of time, to predict seasons, and to affirm that the gods still govern the land. The most famous feature of the temple is the Gateway of the Sun, a single block of andesite weighing several tons, carved with intricate figures. At its center stands a deity with rays, or a headdress extending outward, holding staffs in each hand. Scholars call him the staff god, a figure who appears across the Andes for centuries afterward, even among the Inca. Around him are rows of winged attendants, some with human faces, others with animal heads, pumas, condors, or eagles. The imagery suggests a pantheon where animals and humans shared roles, a reminder that for Tiwanaku, nature and divinity were inseparable. To pass through the Gateway of the Sun was likely symbolic, a passage into sacred space, a threshold between the ordinary and the divine. The carvings may have encoded a calendar, with figures marking days or seasons. If so, the gateway was not only an altar, but also a cosmic chart, its symbols guiding priests in their rituals. For those who gathered at the temple, the gateway was a constant presence, a reminder of the god's gaze and the order of the world. Rituals at Kalasasaya were tied to the movement of the sun. During solstices and equinoxes, priests observed the horizon from within the temple, aligning their gaze with the walls and gateways. When the sun rose or set in alignment with these markers, it confirmed the cycle. Fires were lit, offerings made, and chants sung to honor the return of the season. For a society dependent on farming and a fragile environment, these rituals were more than symbolic, they were reassurance that survival remained possible. Offerings discovered at Tiwanaku suggest a mix of practices: ceramic vessels, stone figurines, and animal remains point to feasts and sacrifices. Llama bones, in particular, appear frequently, indicating that llamas, vital for transport and wool, were also sacred offerings. Some scholars believe that human sacrifices may also have occurred, though evidence is limited. If true, they may have been performed during times of crisis, when priests sought to restore cosmic balance by offering the most precious gift of all, life. For the ordinary people of Tiwanaku, participating in these ceremonies must have been overwhelming. Imagine entering the court at dawn, the cold air biting, the crowd gathering in silence. Priests stand at the gateway of the sun, chanting in deep tones that echo against stone walls. Smoke from burning offerings curls into the sky. When the sun finally rises in perfect alignment with the temple's structure, the court erupts in chants and drums. The moment is not merely astronomical, it is spiritual proof that the world is in order, that the gods are present, and that life can continue. The Kalasasaya was not isolated. It connected to other sacred spaces in Tiwanaku. The semi-subterranean temple, directly in front of it, created a ritual journey. Participants first ascended into the earth, surrounded by walls embedded with carved stone heads. Each head is unique, as if representing different peoples or ancestors brought together. From there, they rose upward into the elevated Kalasasaya court, moving symbolically from the underworld to the heavens. This sequence embodied the Andean worldview: life and death, earth and sky, and human and divine are all part of a single cycle. The carved stone heads themselves are among Tiwanaku's great mysteries. Some depict human faces with distinctive features. Others show skulls or stylized expressions. Scholars debate their meaning. Were they ancestors, preserved in stone to watch over rituals? Were they conquered enemies, a display of power? Or were they symbolic spirits, reminders of humanity's diversity? To stand among them was to feel watched, part of a greater community that stretched across time and space. Daily life outside the temple revolved around agriculture, herding, and crafts. Farmers cultivated potatoes and quinoa using raised fields called sukakalos. Ridge plots surrounded by canals that absorbed heat by day and released it by night, protecting crops from frost. This ingenious system allowed Tiwanaku to feed tens of thousands in an environment that seems almost uninhabitable today. Herds of llamas and alpacas provided wool, meat, and trade goods, linking Tiwanaku to distant regions. Artisans produced ceramics painted with geometric patterns, and textiles woven with images of the staff god, carrying the temple's symbolism into everyday life. But all of this depended on the cosmic order affirmed at Kalasasaya. Without the rituals, without the alignment of sun and stone, survival seemed precarious. The temple was not only a religious site, but also the axis of Tiwanaku's identity. It told the people that they belonged to a cosmos where cycles could be trusted, where God still cared for them, and where their efforts were not in vain. Yet the very grandeur of the temple also reveals fragility. If the gods failed to answer if drought came, if crops failed, the rituals could lose their power. The same ceremonies that once reassured might begin to raise doubt. The people's faith in Kalasasaya was as vulnerable as the climate on which their survival depended. When Tiwanaku declined around the 11th century CE, the temple's rituals must have faltered. Archaeological evidence suggests prolonged drought struck the Altiplano. The raised fields dried, harvests shrank, and the population dwindled. In such times, ceremonies at Kalasasaya may have grown more desperate, with priests performing rituals with greater urgency, sacrifices increasing, and prayers rising unanswered. Eventually, the people abandoned the temple, leaving its stones to the wind. Today, visitors to Kalasasaya see ruins, walls partly reconstructed, the gateway of the sun standing weathered, and the carved heads staring silently from their sockets. Yet even as a ruin, the temple retains its aura. At solstices, crowds still gather, watching the sun rise in alignment as their ancestors once did. The cycle continues, even if the original words and rituals are lost. And so the Kalasasaya leaves us with a question. Did the people of Tiwanaku build this temple more for the gods or for themselves? Was it truly the sun's path they honored, or their own need for certainty in a world of harsh landscapes and fragile survival? Perhaps it was both, and perhaps that is why the temple still speaks. It reminds us that to be human is to seek order in chaos, to carve meaning into stone, even when the stones themselves will one day crumble. The Kalasasaya temple stands today as a ruin, yet its stones still whisper of a civilization that bound its survival to the heavens. For the people of Tiwanaku, this temple was not only a court of stone, but also the center of a worldview. It joined the earthly and the celestial, the living and the ancestral, the fragile harvests of the Altiplano and the eternal cycles of the sun. In this way, Kalasasaya was more than architecture, it was meaning carved into the landscape. When you look at the gateway of the sun, weathered yet still imposing, You see the face of a deity who held staffs in each hand, rays spreading from his head, flanked by attendants. To the Tiwanaku, this figure was not mere decoration. It embodied cosmic order, the force that ensured crops would grow and seasons would return. Each time the sun aligned with the temple's walls during solstices or equinoxes, the people believed that this order was renewed. The gateway was both a door and a promise, a threshold that reminded them the universe was structured, not chaotic. But as with all human creations, the temple's power was fragile. Archaeological evidence suggests that as drought spread across the Altiplano in the 11th century, the carefully balanced systems of Tiwanaku faltered, raised fields dried out, food grew scarce, and the authority of priests weakened. In such times, the rituals at Kalasasaya must have taken on a desperate tone. What had once been celebrations of cosmic harmony may have become pleas for survival. Chants grew longer, sacrifices more urgent, yet the rains did not return. The same walls that once reassured now became reminders of the god's silence. And so, the decline came. The great city of Tiwanaku, which may have supported tens of thousands, shrank and emptied. Its artisans ceased their work, its farmers abandoned fields, and its priests left their courts. The Kalasasaya, once filled with crowds and firelight, fell into silence. Stones cracked in the cold, the gateway toppled, and the winds of the Altiplano swept across abandoned plazas. The gods, it seemed, had departed. For centuries, the ruins lay quiet, visited only by herders, travelers, and local memory. In Andean tradition, Tiwanaku remained a place of significance, its stones tied to ancestral power. Later, the Inca would look to it as a place of origin, claiming that their own sun god had once revealed himself here. Even in ruin, Kalasasaya retained a kind of authority, a sacred aura that outlasted the people who built it. When modern archaeologists began studying Tiwanaku in the 19th and 20th centuries, they found themselves humbled by the scale of its stones. How had a society with no metal tools carved and transported such blocks? How had they aligned them so precisely with the sun? The answers are still debated. Some see genius in the use of simple tools and communal labor. Others wonder if the alignment was partly symbolic, rather than precise. But whatever the method, the fact remains, the people of Tiwanaku built something that endured in both stone and memory. Today, the Kalasasaya temple is partly restored, its walls rebuilt to approximate their original form. Tourists walk through the court. Archaeologists measure alignments, and Andean communities still gather at solstices to greet the sun. At dawn on June 21st, the winter solstice in the southern hemisphere, crowds stand within the temple, waiting for the first rays of light. When the sun appears over the horizon, it shines across the court just as it did 1,000 years ago. The people cheer, drums beat, and fires burn. The cycle continues long after Tiwanaku's fall. What makes Kalasasaya so haunting is not only what it reveals about the past, but also what it says about the human condition. We seek order in the stars, reassurance in rituals, and permanence in stone. We build temples to remind ourselves that survival is not only about food, but about meaning. And yet, like Tiwanaku, all human works are vulnerable to change, to drought, to time. The stones endure, but the voices that gave them life fade. Standing in the temple today, the cold wind pressing against your skin, you can almost imagine the crowd of long ago, their chants rising, their eyes fixed on the horizon, their faith that the sun would return. The stones frame the sky as they always have, silent witnesses to hope, despair, and endurance. And so Kalasasaya leaves us with a final question. Was its greatest achievement the rituals it hosted, or the memory it still holds? Perhaps both. For in its stones, we see not only the past of Tiwanaku, but a reflection of ourselves. Our need to believe that the universe has order, and our determination to carve the belief into stone, even when the winds of time will one day wear it away. The grandeur of Kokura did not lie only in its pyramid. Spread across more than 40 square kilometers were dozens of shrines, sanctuaries, and reservoirs. each playing a role in the life of the capital. To walk through the city in its prime was to move through a landscape where the sacred and the practical merged, where irrigation canals ran alongside temple walls, and where every path led to ritual. At the heart of this network was Prasatam, the vast temple complex crowned by its 7-tiered pyramid. Pilgrims would have approached along a causeway, flanked by guardian statues of lions and mythical beasts. At the pyramid's base, they entered courtyards lined with shrines dedicated to Hindu gods, the air thick with incense and the hum of chants. Within the central sanctuary stood a massive lingam of Shiva, likely one of the largest ever installed in the Khmer world. Carved from a single block of stone, it symbolized the god's generative power, linking divine energy to the fertility of the land. The rituals performed here were both grand and intimate. Priests dressed in white robes offered flowers, oil, and rice at the foot of the lingam, while musicians played drums and flutes. At festivals, processions wound through the city, dancers in elaborate costumes, soldiers bearing standards, and elephants adorned with cloth and bells. Ordinary citizens brought their own offerings, bundles of rice, small clay lamps, or woven garlands. To take part in these ceremonies was not simply devotion, but participation in the rhythm of the kingdom, where gods, kings, and people were bound together. One of Koker's defining features was its colossal sculpture. Unlike the more delicate carvings of Angkor, Koker's statues were monumental, emphasizing power and presence. The statue of Shiva as a 12-armed dancer, once housed in Prasat Crown, the Red Temple, stood more than 3 meters tall. Each arm held a symbolic gesture or weapon, embodying the god's cosmic dance of creation and destruction. Other statues depicted Garuda with wings spread wide, Vishnu reclining on a serpent, and warriors poised in battle. To enter a temple and see such figures towering above must have been overwhelming, a reminder of divine power made tangible. But Koker was not only a place of temples, it was a city sustained by labor. Farmers cultivated rice in the surrounding plains, dependent on reservoirs and canals dug by workers. The Rahalbare, a massive rectangular reservoir, provided water for both agriculture and ritual purification. Artisans carved sandstone blocks, quarrying from nearby hills, shaping statues and building blocks with remarkable precision. Blacksmiths forged tools and weapons, while traders carried goods along roads linking Koker to other Khmer centers. Daily life for ordinary citizens was demanding but structured. A farmer might rise at dawn, tend to his fields, then bring offerings to a local shrine. An artisan might spend weeks chiseling the details of a statue destined for the pyramid. A soldier might drill in the courtyards, his presence a reminder of the king's authority. For all, the temples were ever present, looming over daily tasks, their rituals marking the calendar of work and rest. Yet Koker's rise was as swift as its decline. Within less than 20 years, the city became a capital, flourished, and then lost its status. Why? Historians point to several possibilities. The site was remote, far from the Mekong River and the heart of Khmer power. Maintaining supply lines may have strained resources. Political struggles between royal factions may have forced the capital's relocation back to Angkor. Or perhaps the city was built as a temporary seat of power by Jayavarman IV, intended more as a personal monument than as a permanent capital. For the people who lived there, the abandonment must have been disorienting. Temples that once echoed with chants grew silent. Reservoirs dried, canals silted, and statues toppled. Priests who once tended Shiva's lingam may have left abruptly, their rituals unfinished. Families who had carved out lives in the shadow of the pyramid returned to the Angkor heartland, leaving their homes to the jungle. The city's colossal ambition was undone not by conquest, but by neglect. Centuries later, when travelers stumbled upon Koker, they found its pyramid cloaked in vines and its statues buried in soil. Local villagers wove stories of giants and spirits, explaining the massive stones as the work of beings beyond human strength. In modern times, looters carried away many of its statues, scattering them across the world. Only fragments remained, reminders of a capital that once rivaled Angkor, but survive in memory only as ruins. Today, to stand at Kokur is to feel both awe and melancholy. The pyramid still rises, its terraces eroded, but unmistakable. Trees grow in its cracks, birds circle above, and silence hangs heavy. Yet when you climb its steep steps and look across the forest, you glimpse what Jayavarman IV must have seen. A vision of power, ambition, and devotion reaching toward the sky. And so Kokur's story becomes more than history, it becomes a question. Why would a king pour so much into a city destined to fade? Was it hubris, ambition, or faith? Did Jayavarman IV believe he was founding a new dynasty? Or was Kokur always meant to be temporary? A capital of stone built for glory that would vanish with him? The jungle does not answer, but its silence only deepens the mystery. Deep in the forests of northern Cambodia lies a place that was once the capital of an empire. For a brief moment in the 10th century CE, long before Angkor Wat rose to fame, the Khmer kings shifted their power to a city now called Kokur. Today, it is a quiet site scattered with ruins, strangled by jungle and silence. Yet within its overgrown walls stand temples that tell of ambition, devotion, and sudden decline. Among them rises one of the most unusual monuments in Southeast Asia, a massive step pyramid, towering above the forest. Unlike anything else in the Khmer world, Kokur was founded in 928 CE, when King Jayavarman IV moved the Khmer capital here from Angkor. Why he chose this remote site remains debated. Perhaps it was for political reasons, consolidating power away from rival factions. Perhaps it was strategic, closer to resources like iron and timber. Or perhaps it was personal ambition, a king determined to leave his own mark. Whatever the reason, in less than 2 decades, Kokur became a city of temples, shrines, and monuments, built on a scale that astonishes even today. The centerpiece of Kokur is Prasat Tom, a vast temple complex culminating in a 7-tiered step pyramid rising more than 30 meters high. From its summit, the king and priests could survey the surrounding forests, their gaze stretching across the horizon. Unlike the horizontal layouts of Angkor, this pyramid thrust upward, a symbol of power reaching toward the heavens. Scholars debate whether it was inspired by Indian step temples, by local innovation, or by ambition alone. Whatever its origin, it remains one of the most striking monuments of the Khmer world. Surrounding the pyramid were dozens of other temples, each dedicated to Hindu deities, particularly Shiva. Kokur became famous for its colossal statues, many of them now housed in museums worldwide. These statues, carved from sandstone, depicted Shiva in his various forms, as a cosmic dancer, as a destroyer, as a lord of Linga and fire. Other statues showed Garuda, Vishnu, and warriors, each rendered with power and detail. The scale was unprecedented. Some statues stood over 3 meters tall, weighing tons. To carve and transport them required extraordinary skill and labor. Life in Kokur must have been both awe-inspiring and demanding. The city spread across a wide area, with temples connected by causeways and reservoirs. Water management was vital, as in all Khmer cities, workers dug berets large reservoirs to supply irrigation, linking survival to sacred architecture. Farmers grew rice in the surrounding plains, artisans carved statues, priests tended temples, and soldiers guarded the new capital. For ordinary people, life meant hard labor and service of monumental projects, but also pride in belonging to a city that rivaled Angkor in splendor. Imagine walking into Kokur in its prom, the air heavy with heat and the scent of burning incense, drums sounding in temples, chants rising from priests as processions move through the city. You approach Prasat Tom and see the pyramid rising above the trees, its terraces lined with statues. At its base, a shrine houses a massive lingam of Shiva, the god's presence embodied in stone. Pilgrims enter to offer flowers, rice, or oil, while priests chant hymns. The combination of colossal scale and sacred ritual must have overwhelmed the senses. But Kokur's glory was short-lived. In 944 CE, less than 20 years after it was founded, the Khmer capital shifted back to Angkor. The reasons are not fully known, perhaps political shifts, perhaps logistical challenges of sustaining such a remote site. Once abandoned as a royal capital, Kokor declined rapidly. The jungle advanced, temples crumbled, and statues were toppled. For centuries, it lay forgotten, its pyramid hidden beneath trees, its colossal statues buried in soil. Today, Kokor is quieter than Angkor Wat, visited by fewer travelers. But its ruins are no less powerful. The pyramid rises stark against the forest, its steps weathered but still commanding. Fallen statues, looted shrines, and scattered carvings tell of ambition that flared briefly and then faded. For archaeologists, it is a reminder that even great cities can vanish in the span of a lifetime, their memory swallowed by time. And so the first glimpse of Kokor raises haunting questions. Why did Jayavarman IV build such an ambitious city in so remote a place? Did he believe he was founding a new dynasty, a new vision for the Khmer Empire? Or did he already know it was temporary, a monument less to empire than to his own reign? The stones do not answer, but their silence draws us deeper into the mystery of this deserted pyramid city. The ruins of Kokor tell a story of ambition that burned brightly and faded quickly, leaving behind only silence and stone. For less than 2 decades, it stood as the Khmer capital, a city of colossal temples, statues, and a pyramid that rivaled anything built before or after in the empire. Yet within a generation, it was abandoned, its monuments left to the forest. Few places in history capture so clearly the fragility of power and the impermanence of human achievement. The Prasat Tam Pyramid remains its most haunting symbol, rising in 7 tiers. It is unlike anything else in the Khmer world. To climb it today is to ascend steep, weathered steps, the jungle stretching endlessly around. From its summit, you see not bustling streets and processions, but forests swallowing the past. Yet once, this was the king's vision, to stand above his city, above the plains, as close to the heavens as human hands could build. The pyramid was not simply a temple, but a statement, a declaration that Kokor mattered, that Jayavarman IV's reign would be remembered. But memory is fickle. After the capital returned to Angkor, Kokor was left behind. The jungle grew, statues fell, and rituals ceased. The great lingam of Shiva, once anointed with oil and offerings, was broken. The colossal statues were toppled or looted, many ending up in distant museums. What had been symbols of divine power became fragments, stripped of context. The pyramid endured, but without its rituals, it was only stone. For the people who once lived here, the abandonment must have been both practical and painful. Farmers, artisans, and priests who had invested their labor into temples and canals may have returned to Angkor, carrying with them memories of a city that had briefly been the center of the world. Perhaps they told their children of the pyramid that rose above the forest, of statues so large they seemed alive, of rituals where gods and kings were joined in firelight. In time, even these stories faded, replaced by silence. Kokor's short life raises questions that echo across history. Was it a mistake to move the capital here? Did Jayavarman miscalculate the difficulty of sustaining a city in such a remote area? Or was Kokor always meant to be temporary, a statement of power rather than a lasting seat of rule? We cannot know, but what remains is a reminder of how fragile even the greatest ambitions are. A city can rise and fall within a single lifetime, its glory swallowed by vines and roots. And yet, Kokor is not simply a ruin. It is also a memory of what people can achieve when driven by faith and vision. Its pyramid, its colossal statues, its shrines, and its reservoirs all speak of a society that, even for a brief time, poured extraordinary energy into creating a sacred city. The people of Kokor believed their labor connected them to gods, and that their offerings sustained the universe. In that belief, they found purpose. Today, visitors who make the journey to Kokor find a site quieter than Angkor, less visited, but powerful in its solitude. The pyramid rises starkly against the sky, its terraces lined with trees, its stones weathered but still firm. Walk among the ruins, and you see the bases of shrines, the outlines of reservoirs, and the remnants of roads once filled with processions. The silence is profound, broken only by birds and wind. Yet in that silence, imagination fills the air. You can almost hear drums echoing from the pyramid, chants rising from shrines, and the murmur of pilgrims gathered with offerings. Khokhr's legacy lies not in endurance, but in impermanence. It reminds us that even great capitals can vanish, that ambition can flare and fade, and that monuments are not eternal, however massive. But it also teaches that meaning is found in the act of building itself. For the people of Khokhr, the city mattered while it lived. The gods were honored, the king was glorified, and the people were bound together. That it was later abandoned does not erase the devotion that raised its stones. And so, the deserted pyramid city leaves us with a question. When we build monuments, temples, pyramids, even cities, or are we seeking eternity, or are we simply giving form to our need for meaning in the moment? Khokhr shows us that eternity is fragile, but meaning endures as long as stories are told. The jungle may have swallowed the city, but its stones still rise, reminding us that ambition, however fleeting, leaves traces that speak across the centuries. The ruins of Khokhr tell a story of ambition that burned brightly and faded quickly, leaving behind only silence and stone. For less than 2 decades, it stood as the Khmer capital, a city of colossal temples, statues, and a pyramid that rivaled anything built before or after in the empire. Yet within a generation, it was abandoned, its monuments left to the forest. Few places in history capture so clearly the fragility of power and the impermanence of human achievement. The Prasatam Pyramid remains its most haunting symbol, rising in 7 tiers. It is unlike anything else in the Khmer world. To climb it today is to ascend steep, weathered steps, the jungle stretching endlessly around. From its summit, you see not bustling streets and processions, but forests swallowing the past. Yet once, this was the king's vision, to stand above his city, above the plains, as close to the heavens as human hands could build. The pyramid was not simply a temple, but a statement, a declaration that Khokhr mattered, that Jayavarman IV's reign would be remembered. But memory is fickle. After the capital returned to Angkor, Khokhr was left behind. The jungle grew, statues fell, and rituals ceased. The great lingam of Shiva, once anointed with oil and offerings, was broken. The colossal statues were toppled or looted, many ending up in distant museums. What had been symbols of divine power became fragments, stripped of context. The pyramid endured, but without its rituals, it was only stone. For the people who once lived here, the abandonment must have been both practical and painful. Farmers, artisans, and priests who had invested their labor into temples and canals may have returned to Angkor, carrying with them memories of a city that had briefly been the center of the world. Perhaps they told their children of the pyramid that rose above the forest, of statues so large they seemed alive, of rituals where gods and kings were joined in firelight. In time, even these stories faded, replaced by silence. Khokhr's short life raises questions that echo across history. Was it a mistake to move the capital here? Did Jayavarman miscalculate the difficulty of sustaining a city in such a remote area? Or was Khokhr always meant to be temporary, a statement of power rather than a lasting seat of rule? We cannot know, but what remains is a reminder of how fragile even the greatest ambitions are. A city can rise and fall within a single lifetime, its glory swallowed by vines and roots. And yet, Khokhr is not simply a ruin. It is also a memory of what people can achieve when driven by faith and vision. Its pyramid, its colossal statues, its shrines, and its reservoirs all speak of a society that, even for a brief time, poured extraordinary energy into creating a sacred city. The people of Khokhr believed their labor connected them to gods, and that their offerings sustained the universe. In that belief, they found purpose. Today, visitors who make the journey to Khokhr find a site quieter than Angkor, less visited, but powerful in its solitude. The pyramid rises starkly against the sky, its terraces lined with trees, its stones weathered but still firm. Walk among the ruins, and you see the bases of shrines, the outlines of reservoirs, and the remnants of roads once filled with processions. The silence is profound, broken only by birds and wind. Yet in that silence, imagination fills the air. You can almost hear drums echoing from the pyramid, chants rising from shrines, and the murmur of pilgrims gathered with offerings. Khokhr's legacy lies not in endurance, but in impermanence. It reminds us that even great capitals can vanish, that ambition can flare and fade, and that monuments are not eternal, however massive. But it also teaches that meaning is found in the act of building itself. For the people of Khokhr, the city mattered while it lived. The gods were honored, the king was glorified, and the people were bound together. That it was later abandoned does not erase the devotion that raised its stones. And so, the deserted pyramid city leaves us with a question. When we build monuments, temples, pyramids, even cities, or are we seeking eternity? Or are we simply giving form to our need for meaning in the moment? Khokhr shows us that eternity is fragile, but meaning endures as long as stories are told. The jungle may have swallowed the city, but its stones still rise, reminding us that ambition, however fleeting, leaves traces that speak across the centuries. The Chavan Di Huaner temple complex was not simply a place to worship. It was a carefully designed stage where every stone, every sound, and every shadow played a role in shaping the pilgrim's experience. Unlike the open temples of Egypt or towering pyramids of Mesoamerica, Chavan was inward, secretive, and labyrinthine. It turned the sacred into an intimate, overwhelming encounter, one that blurred the line between architecture and ritual. The priests of Chavan understood sensory manipulation in ways that still astonish archaeologists. The labyrinth of corridors was deliberately confusing. Narrow passages forced pilgrims into single file, pressing them against cold stone. In some places, ceilings dropped so low that visitors had to crouch, heightening vulnerability. Then suddenly the corridor would open into a chamber where sound reverberated unnaturally. The very walls seemed to speak. The use of acoustics was central. Archaeologists have found conch shell trumpets, called puchetas, at Chavan. When blown, they produced a deep, bellowing sound that echoed through the stone passages. To a pilgrim already disoriented by darkness, the blast must have felt like the voice of a god. Priests could remain hidden, unseen, while their sounds reverberated, convincing pilgrims they were in the presence of the divine. Even ordinary voices carried, strangely, bouncing and distorting, as if the stones themselves whispered. Water, too, was part of the ritual. Canals cut beneath the temple carried rushing streams from nearby rivers. In some chambers, water could be released to flood passages, or to roar through hidden channels. Imagine walking in darkness, hearing water thunder beneath your feet, the floor trembling with sound. The element that sustained life became a sacred force, manipulated to awe and overwhelm. There is also evidence of psychoactive substances. Snuff trays and carvings of the San Pedro cactus, known for its hallucinogenic properties, suggest that priests administered visionary plants during rituals. Pilgrims under the influence would have seen the carved deities come alive, their serpent hair writhing, their fanged mouths opening. Combined with sound, water, and darkness, the temple became a living organism, a place where visions and architecture fused. The gods of Chavan were beings of transformation. The Lanzan, with its feline fangs and serpentine hair, embodied the union of opposites, human and animal, earth and sky, predator and prey. Other carvings show eagles with human features, snakes merging into feline bodies, and beings with claws and wings. These were not decorative but symbolic, teaching that divinity transcended categories. To encounter the gods was to be transformed, to leave behind ordinary identity and take on aspects of animals, ancestors, or spirits. Priests, as interpreters of these transformations, held immense power. They alone knew the labyrinth, controlled the sound, and administered the rituals. To the outside world, Chavin must have seemed a place of mystery and authority. Pilgrims came from far regions, the coast, the highlands, and the Amazon, bringing offerings of pottery, textiles, and food. In return, they left transformed, carrying Chavin's imagery and beliefs back to their homes. In this way, the temple spread its influence far beyond its valley, becoming a cultural crossroads of the Andes. Daily life around the temple was shaped by this role. Farmers in nearby valleys grew potatoes, maize, and quinoa, supporting the priests and pilgrims. Herds of llamas provided meat and transport. Artisans carved stone vessels and wove textiles decorated with fanged deities, spreading Chavin style across Peru. Traders brought shells from the coast, feathers from the jungle, and obsidian from distant mountains. All of this flowed into the temple, enriching both its rituals and its authority. For ordinary people, the journey to Chavin must have been both exciting and terrifying. Imagine leaving a small village, carrying offerings of maize or woven cloth, and traveling for weeks through mountains and valleys. Arriving at the temple, you would see terraces rising, walls of stone, and plazas filled with pilgrims. Then priests would lead you into darkness, where sounds echoed, water roared, and visions blurred the line between real and unreal. Emerging again, you would feel changed, as though you had touched something beyond comprehension. The labyrinth itself may have been part of initiation. Perhaps only certain pilgrims were allowed into the deepest chambers, where the Lanzan stood. Others may have remained in outer plazas, watching rituals performed above ground. This hierarchy reinforced priestly power, ensuring that access to the gods was controlled and mediated. Yet for all its power, Chavin was vulnerable. Its authority depended on the continued flow of pilgrims and offerings. If climate shifts disrupted farming or if trade routes faltered, the temple's influence could wane. And indeed, by around 500 BCE, the Chavin culture had declined. Other centers rose, and the labyrinths fell silent. The canals dried, the trumpets were laid aside, and the gods of fangs and serpents were no longer worshipped. Still, the imagery endured. Later Andean cultures, including the Moqui and the Inca, adopted fanged deities and animal-human hybrids. Chavin's vision of transformation continued. Even after its temple was abandoned, its influence stretched across centuries, a reminder that ideas can outlast the stones that first gave them form. Today, walking through Chavin's corridors, carefully lit for preservation, you feel the disorientation the builders intended. The echoes still confuse, the narrow passages still press, and the Lanzan still looms with its grinning fangs, even without ritual. The architecture itself speaks. It tells us that long before writing or empire, people sought to manipulate the senses, to create spaces where humans could encounter the divine, not in abstract thought, but an overwhelming experience. And so, the Chavin labyrinth leaves us with a question. Did the pilgrims truly believe they became something new within these walls? Or was it the priests who shaped their belief? Was the transformation real? Or was it an illusion? Perhaps the answer does not matter, for the experience itself was enough. In darkness, in echo, in vision, the pilgrims felt the gods, and in that feeling, Chavin's power was complete. The Chavin de Huanor temple complex was not simply a place to worship. It was a carefully designed stage where every stone, every sound, and every shadow played a role in shaping the pilgrim's experience. Unlike the open temples of Egypt or towering pyramids of Mesoamerica, Chavin was inward, secretive, and labyrinthine. It turned the sacred into an intimate, overwhelming encounter, one that blurred the line between architecture and ritual. The priests of Chavin understood sensory manipulation in ways that still astonish archaeologists. The labyrinth of corridors was deliberately confusing. Narrow passages forced pilgrims into single file, pressing them against cold stone. In some places, ceilings dropped so low that visitors had to crouch, heightening vulnerability. Then suddenly the corridor would open into a chamber where sound reverberated unnaturally. The very walls seemed to speak. The use of acoustics was central. Archaeologists have found conch shell trumpets, called puchetas, at Chavin, When blown, they produced a deep, bellowing sound that echoed through the stone passages. To a pilgrim already disoriented by darkness, the blast must have felt like the voice of a god. Priests could remain hidden, unseen, while their sounds reverberated, convincing pilgrims they were in the presence of the divine. Even ordinary voices carried, strangely, bouncing and distorting, as if the stones themselves whispered. Water, too, was part of the ritual. Canals cut beneath the temple carried rushing streams from nearby rivers. In some chambers, water could be released to flood passages, or to roar through hidden channels. Imagine walking in darkness, hearing water thunder beneath your feet, the floor trembling with sound. The element that sustained life became a sacred force, manipulated to awe and overwhelm. There is also evidence of psychoactive substances, snuff trays and carvings of the San Pedro cactus, known for its hallucinogenic properties, suggest that priests administered visionary plants during rituals. Pilgrims under the influence would have seen the carved deities come alive, their serpent hair writhing, their fanged mouths opening. Combined with sound, water, and darkness, the temple became a living organism, a place where visions and architecture fused. The gods of Chavin were beings of transformation. The Lanzan, with its feline fangs and serpentine hair, embodied the union of opposites, human and animal, earth and sky, predator and prey. Other carvings show eagles with human features, snakes merging into feline bodies, and beings with claws and wings. These were not decorative but symbolic, teaching that divinity transcended categories. To encounter the gods was to be transformed, to leave behind ordinary identity and take on aspects of animals, ancestors, or spirits. Priests, as interpreters of these transformations, held immense power. They alone knew the labyrinth, controlled the sound, and administered the rituals. To the outside world, Chavin must have seemed a place of mystery and authority. Pilgrims came from far regions, the coast, the highlands, and the Amazon, bringing offerings of pottery, textiles, and food. In return, they left transformed, carrying Chavin's imagery and beliefs back to their homes. In this way, the temple spread its influence far beyond its valley, becoming a cultural crossroads of the Andes. Daily life around the temple was shaped by this role. Farmers in nearby valleys grew potatoes, maize, and quinoa, supporting the priests and pilgrims. Herds of llamas provided meat and transport. Artisans carved stone vessels and wove textiles decorated with fanged deities, spreading Chavin style across Peru. Traders brought shells from the coast, feathers from the jungle, and obsidian from distant mountains. All of this flowed into the temple, enriching both its rituals and its authority. For ordinary people, the journey to Chavin must have been both exciting and terrifying. Imagine leaving a small village, carrying offerings of maize or woven cloth, and traveling for weeks through mountains and valleys. Arriving at the temple, you would see terraces rising, walls of stone, and plazas filled with pilgrims. Then priests would lead you into darkness, where sounds echoed. Water roared, and visions blurred the line between real and unreal. Emerging again, you would feel changed, as though you had touched something beyond comprehension. The labyrinth itself may have been part of initiation. Perhaps only certain pilgrims were allowed into the deepest chambers, where the Lanzan stood. Others may have remained in outer plazas, watching rituals performed above ground. This hierarchy reinforced priestly power, ensuring that access to the gods was controlled and mediated. Yet for all its power, Chavin was vulnerable. Its authority depended on the continued flow of pilgrims and offerings. If climate shifts disrupted farming or if trade routes faltered, the temple's influence could wane. And indeed, by around 500 BCE, the Chavin culture had declined. Other centers rose, and the labyrinths fell silent. The canals dried, the trumpets were laid aside, and the gods of fangs and serpents were no longer worshipped. Still, the imagery endured. Later Andean cultures, including the Moqui and the Inca, adopted fanged deities and animal-human hybrids. Chavin's vision of transformation continued. Even after its temple was abandoned, its influence stretched across centuries. A reminder that ideas can outlast the stones that first gave them form. Today, walking through Chavin's corridors, carefully lit for preservation, you feel the disorientation the builders intended. The echoes still confuse, the narrow passages still press, and the Lanzan still looms with its grinning fangs, even without ritual. The architecture itself speaks. It tells us that long before writing or empire, people sought to manipulate the senses, to create spaces where humans could encounter the divine not in abstract thought, but an overwhelming experience. And so, the Chavin Labyrinth leaves us with a question. Did the pilgrims truly believe they became something new within these walls? Or was it the priests who shaped their belief? Was the transformation real? Or was it an illusion? Perhaps the answer does not matter, for the experience itself was enough. In darkness, in echo, in vision, the pilgrims felt the gods, and in that feeling, Chavin's power was complete.